Okay, everybody, you are very welcome. It is now 5 past the hour. I am actually going to call up our slides to guide us through our discussion and chat on universal design for learning. So you are very welcome, as I say, to our Teaching Toolkit Thursday, the third Thursday of every month, ideally. That's the T3 that it is. So what we are about today is simply, as I say, there's a short presentation in terms of, in this instance, universal design for learning. And then there's an open kind of discussion session that shall follow where we will take questions and indeed kind of share kind of practice and ideas or anything else that comes into your mind. So what are we going to chat about today? So universal design. So interesting enough, universal design is a core principle, the core principle. But then there is universal design for learning. So as I've shown in the slide here, we're going to talk a little bit about universal design as it applies to teaching, learning, and of course, assessment. But the overarching piece of universal design is that it is meant for all. It is universal so that everyone may have access and succeed to the best of their abilities. So that is the kind of clarion call, if you like, in terms of universal design. So I'm going to take a little moment to chat about that terminology, universal design and universal design for learning. I am then going to kind of take a little deep dive in our short presentation on three core principles of universal design for learning that will actually apply to us in our practice. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit about the kind of theoretical component in terms of how it's actually kind of worked. And then we'll go into some detail in terms of practice and how it might be applicable to you and I in our everyday work with our learners, with our curriculum design, with our assessment design, and even thinking about teaching spaces and so on. I have a series of links embedded in the slides, and indeed, we have links after the fact that I will send to you all, including the slide deck. So if you see something to the right or a link in the slides, you'll have the slide deck after the fact. I may or may not mention them, but in this instance, the Ahead collective and this file that you see to the right of the slide is a really wonderful resource. Although it's a few years old, it is fantastic in terms of giving us a great understanding about how and why one would ought to design their curriculum. So let us chat about the different elements. So universal design in and of itself, as I say, is all about how it is we can, as a unit, as a society, as an institution, create an inclusive, a sustainable environment in which everyone can contribute and participate to their fullest extent, to their ideal. And thus, what we're trying to do is instill student success, instill individual success, and giving person, the individual, every opportunity to do that. Interestingly enough, what this actually does for you and I is kind of sets up how it is we ought to design our teaching. So when we think about our curriculum design, we ought not to think about us as an individual lecturer or facilitator, but we need to think about it from the student perspective. So it's going to be universal design is kind of capturing the student-centered nature of how we design our curriculum. And ideally, what that means is we are going to engage our learners, we are going to give them self-regulation and agency about how it is they engage with us, with our learning materials, and hopefully give them enough scope, enough different kinds of opportunities to both learn and engage with that content. And that's really important in terms of thinking about our design. So in terms of the universal design for learning, the specificity of that is focused on curriculum design and making sure that there are equal opportunities across the board from the, as I say, from the teaching, learning, and assessment perspectives. So that's really important. And what this should kind of reflect in yours and my practice is how it is we actually think about and design our curriculum in a wholly inclusive way, so that we're constantly thinking about the best solutions, the more appropriate solutions. We are being adaptive to kind of emerging needs. And most importantly, we are responsive to our learners' needs as we see and engage with them. And that kind of immediate flexibility and adaptability is really important in terms of engaging with our community as a whole and making them feel wanted, making their, supporting their well-being, and giving them that opportunity and knowing, I suppose, establishing almost like a partnership and knowing that they have and we have their kind of best needs at heart. And this, in terms of the couple of links here, the 7 C's for student success, and the recent report, Rethinking 21st Century Student Success in Ireland, capitalize or kind of engage in that kind of dialogue about what it means to provide a curriculum, to provide an environment that's going to support their learners. So if you haven't come across those, the first one is actually a lovely little kind of short document that's really useful in giving us guidance. So all of this has been embraced by UCD strategy. So we have our University for All. And this is an initiative that basically is going to involve the entire community, has involved the entire community in terms of redesigning and thinking our curriculum. And it's something that is a constant. So it's not something that we have done and managed and said, there it is, it's done, I've redesigned my curriculum. It is something that we return to iteratively. We keep on developing, we keep on rethinking, we keep on giving opportunity. And it's fantastic to see that the new O'Connor Centre for Teaching and Learning that has just opened up is really part of the embodiment of that strategy, if you like, in a physical presence. So having these active learning spaces and a variety of them is really important to engage learners in a whole new dynamic. So what does it mean for you and I in our practice? So universal design for learning, there's a lovely kind of construct in terms of thinking about why it is one learns, what it is one learns, and how one learns. And how this kind of manifests in each of these kind of domains is to think about, in terms of the why for learning, what is the purpose of the particular topic, particular module? How do we stimulate interest? How do we engage our learners? And ideally, what we're trying to do is kind of encourage our learners to figure out what it is they want from a given module. Perhaps it's a learning contract, perhaps it's a simple open dialogue or discussion of expectations. But this is a way of engaging our learners and stimulating and providing guidance and support continually throughout a body of learning. In terms of the what of the learning, this is the material kind of body, so to speak. And what we're trying to do is reflect what we give our learners, reflect what they need and what they want. So what I mean by that is making certain that we have multimedia in our content and our delivery. So there may be the audio, the visual, there may be reading materials, there may be cognitive activities as well as physical activities. So there may be kind of peer-to-peer kind of discussions, there may be engagement with kind of digital resources and so forth and so on. All of these things are really important to enable the individual to kind of grasp and understand the content. And then the how of the learning is kind of almost at the kind of end point. This is kind of by way of how a student actually kind of expresses their emerging understanding, their development. And it could be through given activities, it could be through how we communicate. Perhaps sometimes it's the transversal skills within our teaching, that idea of kind of perhaps interdisciplinary cohorts working together, project kind of learning, collaborative learning and so forth. All of those kind of transversal skills are really important to develop and allow our learners a means of expression in multiple modes. And the most important thing in that component is to be certain that we are developing the agency of our learners. And sometimes this means giving them a choice about how they submit an assignment. So it doesn't have to be an essay, it's still mapping towards the same criteria. So it could be a podcast, it could be a visual, it could be a poster. So that kind of component is really important to think about. And for you and I, it should not be onerous in terms of actually doing something like that. It's simply a kind of a flex, that adaptability, that responsive piece that you and I can actually choose to use. So what I've tried to do here is actually redo those kind of 3 domains and actually capture some of the tangible outputs that you and I could actually kind of put together for our students and indeed for ourselves. So you can see across the board from engagement perspective, there's a couple of things in terms of faculty. We all should have an inclusivity statement within our module. Certainly they're at program level, but we can kind of bring that down to a modular level. We might even bring it down to a session level. We certainly have teaching and learning strategies, and that's important in terms of making certain and making clear, transparent what it is you and I should do and how we should do it on behalf of our learners. And similarly, the assessment and feedback strategy is there as well. So oftentimes that's embodied in the foundation of a module, but we may need to bring that out and express that and talk about that to our learners. From the learner perspective, in terms of the engagement, self-assessment is a really lovely way of getting them and stimulating their interest in an ongoing basis. It could be through quizzes, checklists, frequently asked questions. There's a whole array of things we could do. And the idea of reflective practice, it's not just reflective practice on, thinking about a clinical placement or thinking about, how I've done something in the past. Ideally, what reflective practice really is in the learning realm is something to reflect on each time we've done a session, each time we've engaged with the lecture. What is it that you learned from that? What is it that you still need to learn? Or what do you have issue with going forward? So that kind of reflective practice is important. So the idea of the kind of self-assessment questions or a checklist is a way of kind of managing and supporting that. The second domain, in terms of representation, so I have a little asterisk beside the instructional design, how we design things. We are very lucky in that Brightspace has given us a nice kind of template to kind of plug things in. However, again, we need to be adaptable to that and kind of design our teaching that's going to be responsive to the needs of our learners. And that means we have to look at who our learners are, where they're coming from. So if it's a large cohort with diverse student base, the level of the cohort, all of these things are going to take, we have to take kind of acknowledge and kind of put into practice for that. Again, in terms of Brightspace, there is the Ally tool, which will validate content that we put into it vis-a-vis kind of accessibility. And that's really kind of simple and empowering tool, quite frankly, to make certain that what we're providing is actually accessible across the board. And similarly for PowerPoint and Word and so forth, we can do that. And we should be doing that as kind of second nature to make sure that our content is fit for purpose for all. So from the learner's perspective, the idea of hybrid or blended learning is an interesting kind of way of giving them different modalities. So interestingly enough, the majority of us are campus-based in a lecture theatre, but the majority of us also have the opportunity to capture said lecture or a component thereof. And that's a way of actually kind of increasing the representation of what it is we do in a given session and providing the students an extra component that they can engage with after the fact or as an alternative. So the whole HyFlex hybrid learning piece is something to be taken advantage of. And similarly, within Brightspace, we have different opportunities about how we give feedback and how we deliver support. So there is audio and video that is embedded within Brightspace, or that we can embed if we so desire. So those are really important to think about and to do. The final one, excuse me, action and expression. So from our perspective, it's the curriculum. What exactly are we doing at a given point in time? What are the specific learning objectives per session? And what I mean by those is we have a module outcomes that we're working towards constantly in terms of our curriculum alignment, but every given session should be a subset of the module outcomes. So what I often say is they are kind of micro outcomes or session objectives. And what I mean by that is in a given session like this one, perhaps, we say we are going to discuss the impact of universal design on our practice. And that means that there is an action that comes out of that, which is our discussion. And maybe there's a kind of an output in terms of capturing that and so forth. So having session objectives, the clarity of purpose is really important. The second component to that, and naturally kind of leading in, is when we have our outcomes that we're working towards, what we also have immediately in our mind, and so do our students, is how is that assessed? So what we're thinking about all the time is, do we have inclusive assessment? And what does that look like? And we'll come back to that momentarily. And the assessment as learning and assessment for learning are formative assessment opportunities. These are things that we can do in session or tangential to sessions, a diagnostic test or a kind of post-session quiz. And the assessment as learning are activities that will happen in session. And these are ways of engaging students in multiple modes. And that's really important in terms of what those activities are, because that's a focus point for getting students wholly engaged and getting people in different ways to engage with one another, with the content, with worksheets or whatever it is that we may have devised. So there's a lot in there, so we can come back to that and think about that momentarily. So in terms of inclusive assessment, we have the inclusive assessment framework here in UCD that my colleagues have developed. And I suppose the kind of key kind of piece to think about this is my assessment inclusive? Or rather, how do I make my assessment protocol more inclusive? So invariably, we will have perhaps a couple of components of assessment within the 12-week cycle of a module. And attached to those, there are probably assessment as and for learning. There are formative pieces that come prior to summative submission. And these pieces can be kind of managed and supported in an inclusive fashion. So we can scaffold and prepare someone before they submit an essay. So there might be drafts, there might be discussions, there might be shared annotated bibliography and so forth. These are ways of making it inclusive. So there's a lovely big kind of deep dive, if you like, into that to think about how we can do that and support universal design for learning. So coming to the ends, within UCD, there are a huge array of resources already available, not only from ourselves in teaching and learning, but from the wider community. And I've kind of highlighted a couple of here for you. There's a lovely new resource, if you haven't come across it, from IT services, the accessibility statements in terms of each kind of piece of technology and component that is available to us, either within Blackboard within Brightspace or supported by Brightspace. And these are really important because, again, it's about that transparency. It's about that clear intention of what something is to do and how to do it and how to engage with it. There is also, from our Access and Lifelong Learning colleagues, a series of resources such as the Toolkit for Universal Design in Higher Education, which has a whole raft of case studies of practice about how people have integrated universal design for learning within their practice. And there's a big shout out here to kind of remind everyone that you need not do universal design in every given session, in every given moment. What we're trying to think about is the holistic approach. So across those 12 weeks, there is different modalities, different means of engagement, action, and expression. And in that way, it's manageable for you and I, and indeed for our learners. We don't want to overwhelm our learners. So there is a balancing act to achieve in that respect. So if you aren't aware of it already, our colleagues in Access Lifelong Learning run a digital badge on universal teaching and learning, and indeed beyond the classroom, universal design. So there's a new one coming out or ready for people to engage with. The link is there. I will send the link with the slides after the fact. But this is a short online course to support you in devising your own approaches to kind of recalibrate, to redesign, to think about how it is you are engaging with universal design in your teaching and learning practice. So that wraps the presentation part up. The link to the left is for our teaching and learning toolkit resources. And as you can see, there's another book there in the middle, Universal Design for Curriculum Design, which has another set of case studies. So as I say, there's a vast wealth of materials out there for you and I to engage with. So our next session on the 19th of February is all about supporting students' academic integrity. And I'm delighted to say that I will be joined by our student as partners in that session. So that will be really kind of interesting and lovely to get that kind of perspective. For now, let us stop the video and let us invite any questions, observations, and ideas to share. So thank you for listening.